For 45 years, they swore they would never give it up. Not under sanctions, not under airstrikes, not under the most crushing diplomatic pressure any nation has faced in the modern era. Iran's enriched uranium was never just a weapons program. It was the regime's identity, its claim to regional dominance, its ultimate insurance policy, the card that made every enemy hesitate and every negotiation bend toward Tehran. And then, in the span of 2 weeks, it was gone. Iran has agreed not to possess nuclear weapons. Iran has agreed to surrender its stockpiles of enriched uranium, and they've agreed to it completely. Read that again. Not a ceasefire, not a pause, not a temporary suspension that Iran could quietly reverse in 6 months. A full surrender of the most strategically significant asset the Islamic Republic has ever possessed. The red line the IRGC swore, for decades, it would die before crossing. Crossed. And the way it happened, without a single American soldier entering Iranian territory, is the part of this story that even Washington didn't fully anticipate. Stay with me. Because what just happened in Iran is one of the most consequential events in Middle Eastern history, and the full weight of it has not yet landed. To understand why this moment is historically shattering, you need to understand what that uranium actually represented. Not technically, but strategically. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, had capped Iran's enrichment at 3.67% purity, with a $300 stockpile ceiling under continuous international inspection. It kept Iran's nuclear capabilities at a safe distance from weapons-grade material. Then Trump withdrew from the deal in his first term. Tehran released the brakes, first to 20% enrichment, then 60%. By June 2025, Iran's 60% enriched stockpile had exceeded 440 kilograms, enough fissile material, properly processed, for more than 10 nuclear warheads. The so-called breakout time, the window between a political decision to build a bomb and the technical ability to detonate one, had collapsed to near zero. For Israel, this was not an abstract security debate. It was an existential nightmare with a running clock. For Saudi Arabia, a nuclear-capable Tehran meant the end of whatever strategic balance the Gulf had maintained. For the United States, it meant the beginning of the most dangerous nuclear proliferation cascade in modern history, with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey each privately signaling they would pursue their own programs in response. The uranium was stored across 3 underground fortresses built to survive American and Israeli airstrikes. Natanz, buried in mountains, encased in concrete and lead. Isfahan, holding half the stockpile in tunnels over 90 meters deep. Fordow, constructed inside a mountain engineered to resist the most powerful conventional weapons in existence. The June 2025 strikes had severely damaged these facilities, but here is what bombs cannot solve. Uranium enriched to 60% doesn't disappear. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't become harmless. It can remain at weapons-relevant enrichment levels for hundreds of years. The strikes destroyed the infrastructure. They didn't destroy the material, and material, given time and resources, can be rebuilt around. This is what drove the Pentagon to present Trump with a ground operation plan that defense officials described in unambiguous terms as more complex than Normandy. The 82nd Airborne Paradropping into hostile territory. Delta Force and Navy SEALs blasting through 300 feet of rubble. Operators in hazmat suits advancing through radioactive tunnels step by step under continuous Iranian missile and drone fire for weeks. Only a few dozen soldiers in the entire United States military are trained in nuclear material recovery operations. Former defense officials called it something they could not recommend executing. Trump looked at that plan. Then he looked at a 21-mile-wide strait in the Persian Gulf. And he chose the strait. On April 13th, the U.S. Navy declared a full blockade of Iranian ports at the Strait of Hormuz. Shadow Fleet vessels that had moved Iranian oil through back channels for years turned back. 97% of Iran's oil had been flowing to China American destroyers, redirected Chinese-linked tankers regardless. The surveillance was total. The enforcement was absolute. But the blockade didn't just stop oil exports. The bulk of Iran's food imports came by sea: wheat, rice, cooking oil, pharmaceuticals, industrial spare parts. The blockade sealed both ends of Iran's economic circulatory system simultaneously. Nothing went out, nothing came in. And in Tehran's highest decision-making rooms, the people who understood the numbers did the math the blockade forced them to do. Within 10 days, oil wells would begin shutting down from storage overflow, and once shut, some would never fully recover. Within 10 days, food stock buffers in major cities would begin running visibly thin. Within 10 days, the money flow sustaining every function of the Iranian state, soldier salaries, proxy network financing, the government subsidies holding together the last threads of the social contract, would be effectively zero. And so the regime faced a question no amount of sanctions had ever forced them to confront this directly. What does a government accomplish with a nuclear program when its people cannot find fuel? Uranium is a bargaining chip. Hormuz is a matter of regime survival. And when those two things come into direct conflict, only one determines whether the regime exists next month. Iran came to the table, and it brought the uranium. But here is the layer of this story that the headlines don't capture, the layer that is more dangerous than the agreement itself. Iran is not a unified state governed from a single center. It never has been, and right now it is more fractured than at any point in its post-revolutionary history. On one side, President Masoud Pezeshkian, the pragmatist. He wanted a ceasefire before the war reached its current intensity. He has been publicly warning, in language extraordinary for a sitting Iranian president, that the economy will completely collapse within 3 weeks. His position is cold-eyed and clear. Hand over the uranium. Lift the blockade. Keep the regime standing. Institutional humiliation? Yes. But a humiliated regime still exists. An economically annihilated regime does not. On the other side, IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi, and what he has been doing while negotiations proceeded, is not passive objection. It is an active seizure of state power, blocking presidential appointments, filling intelligence ministry positions himself outside the constitutional process, pressuring the Supreme National Security Council to be replaced with IRGC loyalists, effectively seizing executive powers that constitutionally belong to the civilian government. Pezeshkian formally demanded those powers be returned. Vahidi refused. This is not a policy disagreement. This is a constitutional coup, executing in slow motion, inside a regime simultaneously trying to negotiate with Washington, manage popular uprisings across dozens of cities, maintain military operations with soldiers who are deserting in groups, and prevent an economic collapse that is 2 weeks away. And above both of them, the ghost of constitutional authority. Mujtaba Khamenei, the declared supreme leader, almost never seen in public. Constitutionally, the commander-in-chief of all Iranian armed forces. In practice, barely functioning. The legitimacy vacuum this creates is the single most important enabler of the IRGC's power seizure. Every decision requires authorization that cannot be obtained, which means the entity willing to act without authorization wins the institutional contest. The IRGC is willing to act without authorization. That is the entire point of what Vahidi has been doing. Now place the uranium handover decision into this picture and ask the question every intelligence service watching Tehran is asking right now. Can the IRGC sabotage this? Technically, yes. It could obstruct the physical handover, block access to storage facilities, delay inspections, and create bureaucratic friction that extends the timeline indefinitely while claiming good faith. It could move stockpiles to underground facilities Iran has never officially acknowledged. The IAEA has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities. It could underreport, surrender a portion of the stockpile publicly while retaining a concealed reserve that preserves the technical option it is publicly abandoning. The declared stockpile becomes the verified stockpile. The undeclared remainder becomes the insurance policy. But whether these options can be executed in practice depends on one critical question. Does the IRGC believe it can survive what happens if Trump concludes Iran is not complying? Because that is a specific and dangerous thing to do to a specific and dangerous man, with 3 carrier strike groups deployed and a ground operation plan already drawn up and sitting on a shelf. The IRGC faces 3 options. None of them are good. Option 1, accept the handover. Institutional suicide. The resistance narrative collapses. The legitimacy of the IRGC's entire existence is fundamentally questioned. But the regime survives, and a surviving regime is a platform from which something can eventually be rebuilt. Option 2, sabotage the deal and continue the war. This invites Trump to play every card simultaneously. The blockade intensifies. The ceasefire ends. The ground operation plan stops being a document on a shelf and becomes an order in execution. The 82nd Airborne Delta Force, SEAL teams, the full architecture of the most complex military operation since Normandy, becomes the IRGC's direct consequence for choosing defiance over surrender. Option 3, internal coup, topple Pezeshkian, declare military rule, end the diplomatic process. This removes the last faction arguing for regime preservation through negotiation and hands the entire Iranian state to the organization whose strategy produced the current catastrophe. As one analyst put it, hammering the final nail into an already collapsing regime. All 3 options mean loss. The calculation being made in Tehran right now, in the silence between Trump's announcement and Iran's official confirmation that has not yet come, is simply which loss is most survivable. The regional implications of this moment are already reshaping the Middle East's strategic architecture before the ink on any agreement has dried. For Israel, the Iranian nuclear handover removes the single threat that has dominated its national security planning for 2 decades. Within hours of Trump's announcement, Netanyahu signaled readiness to engage in Lebanon ceasefire talks. The timing was not coincidental. Hezbollah without Iranian nuclear backing is a fundamentally different organization. The psychological architecture of Iran's entire proxy network was built partly around the implied protection of a nuclear deterrent. Remove the deterrent, and every proxy recalculates its risk exposure without that umbrella. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the relief is real but complicated. The nightmare scenario, a nuclear-armed Iran triggering a regional proliferation cascade, has been avoided. But the Gulf states are not simply exhaling and returning to previous positions. They are moving actively, immediately. Because the lesson of the past months is not just that Iran's nuclear program is gone, the lesson is that Iran's entire strategic architecture, the Hormuz control doctrine, the proxy network, the resistance economy, the deterrence through nuclear ambiguity, has been exposed as more fragile than anyone believed. And fragility, once revealed, invites permanent response. The most consequential long-term development emerging from this crisis is not the uranium handover. It is what the Gulf states are doing about Hormuz itself. For 4 decades, Iran's capacity to close that 21-mile strait, choking 20% of the world's oil supply, was the structural foundation of Tehran's leverage in every room it entered. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have now concluded that this leverage must not be managed or deterred. It must be eliminated architecturally by removing the geographic dependency that made it possible in the first place. Massive bypass pipelines and canal projects are now underway across the Arabian Peninsula. Routes designed to carry Gulf oil and gas to global markets without transiting Hormuz. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Infrastructure that will take years to complete, but whose strategic logic is not primarily economic. It is geopolitical. When Gulf oil can reach global markets without touching Hormuz, the Islamic Republic's ultimate card is cancelled, permanently without a military strike, without any Iranian agreement or cooperation. The geography itself is being re-engineered to make the threat impossible, not simply deterred against. This is historically unusual strategic thinking, not fighting over terrain, but eliminating the terrain's strategic value by building around it. Iran's ultimate weapon will be cancelled not by American warships maintaining an indefinite blockade, but by Saudi and Emirati construction equipment moving through desert terrain while the world watches the diplomacy. The geopolitical revolution being engineered in the Gulf is quieter than everything else happening in this crisis. It is also more permanent. But between Trump's announcement and that permanent future lies the most dangerous period of this entire crisis. The hours immediately following a forced public capitulation by an organization like the IRGC are not hours of stability. They are the hours when internal calculations reach their most acute and most unpredictable in point. Because the IRGC's entire institutional identity, the story it tells itself, the Iranian people and its proxy partners about why it exists, why it controls the economy, why it demands the budgets and the privileges and the authority that it does, rests entirely on the claim of unbreakable resistance. That claim just broke, publicly announced by the American president, broadcast to every government, every population, and every proxy organization that has been told for 45 years that the uranium was the red line that would never be crossed. Hezbollah is running the math. The Houthis are running the math. Iraqi militias are running the math. If Iran surrendered its nuclear card under 2 weeks of economic pressure, what does that tell us about the value of the protection we were promised? Those questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. And the Iranian people, who state television assured had 87% war support, citing a poll from a source that was never named, are standing in fuel lines in an oil-producing country, watching the regime that demanded their sacrifices for regional dominance surrender the centerpiece of that dominance to the nation it has called the Great Satan since 1979. The 2009 Green Movement erupted from a stolen election. The 2019 uprising erupted from a gasoline price increase. The 2022 wave erupted from a young woman dying in police custody. Each was triggered by a single visible injustice that crystallized years of accumulated grievance. The current conditions are heavier than all 3 of those moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, and diplomatic surrender, happening simultaneously. The trigger that ignites the next wave doesn't need to be dramatic. The kindling is already everywhere. Here's the picture as it stands. Trump announced that Iran has agreed to surrender its nuclear stockpile. Iran has not officially confirmed this. Between the announcement and the confirmation lies a gap. And in that gap, the IRGC's decision about whether to accept institutional humiliation or escalate toward regime destruction is still being made. Vahidi is seizing state functions. Pezeshkian is demanding them back. The supreme leader is incapacitated. The blockade holds. The storage tanks are filling. The oil wells are approaching shutdown. Soldiers are deserting. Proxy networks are questioning whether dying for Tehran still makes strategic sense. The Gulf states are building infrastructure that will make Hormuz irrelevant before the decade ends. And somewhere in the underground facilities that American strikes buried under rubble, the uranium that the IRGC called its national pride, its resistance shield, its reason for existence, is sitting in conditions that no inspector has yet accessed and no one in Washington can fully verify. The United States accomplished something its own defense officials called nearly impossible. It convinced Iran to surrender its most strategic asset without executing the most complex military operation since Normandy. It didn't send the 82nd Airborne. It didn't deploy Delta Force into 90-meter tunnels and hazmat suits. It closed the strait. It turned time against a regime already cracking from within. And it waited at a table until the mathematics of survival overrode 45 years of ideological commitment. It worked, at least on paper, at least according to one announcement, at least for now. But the IRGC's silence in the hours since that announcement is not necessarily acceptance. It might be the calm before the most dangerous decision the organization has ever made, because surrendering the uranium surrenders the narrative. And the narrative is all the IRGC has left. Something unthinkable just happened in Iran. And the most unthinkable part is not the surrender itself. It is what happens next, inside the regime that was forced to make it. That answer is still being decided in Tehran, in tunnels, in rooms where men who have built their entire lives around one story are choosing between survival and the only identity they have ever known. The world is watching, and the clock has never been closer to midnight.